Thank you for joining me, Gary Zacharias, and you're listening to the Apologist bookshelf. I'm back to another Natasha Crain book. I like all of her materials so much. This is Talking with Your Kids About Jesus. That was a follow-up book to some of her others. 30 conversations every parent must have, and I've done 3 podcasts in the past. And I'm just kind of walking my way. Sometimes I just jump in the middle of a book, but I'm walking my way through this one. I've done chapters 1, 2, and 3. And so let me go back. So that covered, is Jesus a myth? Is he the Messiah? Is he God? And I want to do 4 and 5, which is dealing with miracles. And so that's huge, isn't it? She says, by definition, what's a miracle? An extraordinary event manifesting divine intervention in human affairs. And so she's saying, if we're asking if miracles are possible, we're asking if it's possible that there could be exceptional events in our universe that have a supernatural cause. Now look at that word supernatural. Super is beyond, so beyond the natural. So in other words, are we looking for a cause from outside of nature? And she says, if you define the question this way, we can see the answer depends, pretty obvious, does anything outside of nature exist? If the natural world is all there is, right, just the stars and the sea and the sky and the rocks and all that kind of stuff. If the natural world is all there is, then what about miracles? They're not possible. Nothing can have a new supernatural cause if nothing supernatural exists, if nothing beyond nature exists. But if there's a being that exists beyond nature, like God, at least it's possible, logically, that he could choose to intervene in this natural world. So she says, what it comes down to? When you're talking about whether miracles could possibly exist, it's really a question of, does God exist? And she did some chapters on that question with the evidence for God in her book called Talking with Your Kids About God. And I've done previous podcasts on that. And I hope all of you, if I just take a second now and say, here's my challenge. So the question of whether God exists, that's huge. Do we all have at least quick answers? They wouldn't necessarily have to be scientifically in depth or anything like that, but do we have some quick reasons to believe that there is a God? And I would say, sure. You start with the existence of the universe. What's the best reason that there's something here at all? The universe, the start of life, the complexity of life. Where do we get consciousness? Where do we get moral obligations? These are the kinds of things that can be best answered, frankly, by saying there's a God. All right, so then let's move on here. So she talks a little bit about, did Jesus perform miracles? And she said they are in the earliest sources that are about him, so they're not added a lot later. They're in multiple independent sources throughout the whole New Testament. It was a part of Jesus' ministry. And he got crowds around him because of those works. Even his opponents didn't deny the amazing nature of his works. Jewish writings said, it was in the Talmud, the commentary about the Jewish writings, and it says he performed miracles. Well, they say that was sorcery. But notice that at least they did say he did something out of the ordinary. And she says also that there is strong historical evidence for the resurrection. Again, that's been done in different podcasts, so we won't do that today. And those miracles had a purpose, didn't they? They served a specific purpose in God's plan as a way to, in a sense, authenticate God's messenger. Is this person from God? Let's see what he does. Okay, he's doing miracles. He's from God. So she says the key point in this section as she wraps up before she gets to the part that I want to really focus on. So she says, if miracles are ever possible, then it's a question of, yes, if God exists, they are possible. And then she's got these pieces of evidence. All right, let's move to this part here. I think this is good. Did ancient people believe in miracles because they're more gullible? And that's a possibility, right? Richard Carrier, he's an atheist. He says, he has an essay. I love the title of this essay. That's why I'm laughing. So he's an atheist activist. His name is Richard Carrier. He says in his essay, Kooks and Quacks of the Roman Empire, a look into the world of the Gospels. Okay, you got that? So you can pretty well set up. You know where he's going to go with this. So here's what Richard Carrier says. There's abundant evidence that these were times replete with kooks and quacks of all varieties, from sincere lunatics to ingenious frauds, even innocent men mistaken for divine. And there was no end to the fools and loons who would follow and praise them. Placed in this context, this is still Richard Carrier, placed in this context, the Gospels no longer seem to be so remarkable. And this leads us to an important fact. When the Gospels were written, skeptics and informed or critical minds were a small minority. Although the gullible, the credulous, and those ready to believe or exaggerate stories of the supernatural are still abundant today, they were much more common in antiquity and taken far more seriously. Okay, so do you see what he's saying there? No wonder Jesus was able to get away with this claim of doing miracles, because people were so stupid back then. People believe bizarre things, right? So he says basically what Carrier's saying, we should discount credibility of the gospel. They're written when people believed anything, and that the gospels are similar to other writings of that time period. So she said, let's take a look at what he's just talked about there. It said, first, he says people today continue to believe in the supernatural. He's not really dismissing just ancient claims. He's dismissing any worldview that involves the supernatural. Why? Because he assumes beforehand. He hasn't even looked at the evidence. He just assumes that nothing supernatural exists. In other words, he's a materialist, right? The material world is all there is. So he labels people gullible if they believe otherwise. But she says, that's not an argument. It's just an assumption based on his own worldview. So he just looks around at other people and says, you're a lunatic because you don't believe what I believe. Secondly, she says, thinking about Richard Carrier, if you set aside the assumption that nothing supernatural exists, she says the logic of his case fails on its own merits. Why? She says it's like this. Suppose somebody says, throughout history there have been all kinds of medical cures that we no longer believe work. Some of them are pretty crazy. And yet there were times in history many people believed in them. So we should immediately discount all claimed medical cures in history and today. Well, Carrier wouldn't say that. He believes that some medical cures are legit. He wouldn't dismiss all of them just because some of them were false. Yeah, so she says in the same way, there are a lot of supernatural claims. They vary widely. You don't just lump them together like Carrier does. And then she again talks about Carrier, he says there's nothing remarkably different about the claims of the Gospels compared with others from the ancient world. She says, not true. Many scholars recognize the biblical worldview is vastly different when it comes to supernatural worldviews throughout history. And there's a scholar, she quotes, John Oswald. He's an Old Testament scholar. He says there were huge differences between ancient worldviews. And here's how Oswald, concludes this. That one's deity could act in history was no new idea, but that was the only place he acted that had significance for human beings, that those actions were according to a consistent long-term purpose, that he was using the details of human historical behavior to reveal that purpose, and that he was just as capable of using enemies as he was friends to accomplish his good purposes. He says that, I maintain, is not found anywhere else in the world, ancient or modern, outside of the Bible and its direct derivatives. So did you hear that? So he's saying that, a lot of societies said their deity could act in history, but the Bible says God is doing this with human beings with some significance according to a purpose, that he used details of the human behavior to reveal the purpose, and he could use enemies as well as friends to accomplish these. So the quality of the evidence is very different than other worldviews and all. So she moves on in this chapter here. Are people who believe in miracles gullible, right? That's the big question. So she says, well, it's unreasonable to lump all supernatural claims together. And she says it's also unreasonable to lump all miracle claims together for evaluation. They have to be considered on a case-by-case basis. Gosh, no kidding. Exactly. So she says if you're going to declare anyone who believes any miracle as a gullible person is assuming that the supernatural does not exist. But she says, one more time, that's an assumption, not an argument. So she said, let's look more specifically. Is there good reason to believe that those who claim Jesus performed miracles were gullible? Let's look at them. She said, yeah, there were a lot of reported miracles in the ancient world, but she says, we know from historical writings that ancient people didn't indiscriminately believe everything they heard, as skeptics suggest. She quotes New Testament scholar Craig Keener. He has a book on miracles. And here's a quote from Keener. The majority of ancient historians were critical of some reports while accepting the possibility of others. So they didn't a priori, meaning before the evidence, they didn't decide ahead of time, in other words, that all claims of paranormal events were either authentic or inauthentic. So Keener says, actually, ancient people are a lot like us. Some they were gullible, right? They'd accept anything, and others were more skeptical. Ancient people did widely believe that the deities could heal, but it said there's strong historical evidence that Jesus drew large crowds. These are people who witnessed what he did, and they followed him because of what they saw, not because somebody, gave them third-hand stories. So to claim that people believed in Jesus' healings because they're gullible is really claiming that the crowds were deceived by something they witnessed, not just what they heard secondhand. She said that's pretty hard to make that case. Says, how would so many eyewitnesses get fooled in multiple contexts and locations? And was Jesus even the kind of person who would intentionally fool people? People look at the life of Jesus and they admire him. She says even more telling, though, is what ancient people believed about the kind of resurrection miracle the apostles claimed for Jesus. In other words, a new, personal, embodied life for an individual after death. Nobody believed that kind of miracle could happen. And N.T. Wright has a classic work called The Resurrection of the Son of God. This is the thought world of Jesus' time, according to Wright. Death was all-powerful. One could neither escape it in the first place nor break its power once it had come. The ancient world was divided into those who said resurrection couldn't happen, even though they might have wanted it, and those who said they didn't want it to happen, knowing that it couldn't anyway. So this is still N.T. Wright, when the early Christians spoke of Jesus being raised from the dead, the natural meaning of the statement throughout the ancient world was the claim that something had happened to Jesus which had happened to nobody else. A great many things supposedly happened to the dead, but resurrection did not. She says we even find that kind of resurrection in the Gospels. She says, take a look at Matthew 28:17. It says, disciples met the risen Jesus in Galilee after his death and burial, and after they met him, they worshipped him, but, quote, some doubted. Isn't that interesting? In Luke 24, Jesus is eating a piece of fish right in front of the disciples, so they'll believe that he's not a ghost. In John 20, Thomas didn't accept the resurrection reports. He said he'd have to personally see the marks on Jesus' hands and side. So the Gospels don't read as if the resurrection was a miracle everybody just kind of casually accepted. So her point is that people in the ancient world didn't believe in this kind of resurrection miracle, and neither did the disciples until they became convinced it had happened. Then they risked their lives to proclaim what they'd witnessed. That's pretty good, powerful evidence that belief in the resurrection, like Jesus's, wasn't simply a product of a gullible culture. The disciples believed he'd been raised from the dead despite what their culture belief was, that things like that couldn't happen. So what's her winding this up here at the end? By the way, I really like what she does. At the end of every chapter, she says key points, and she has a conversation guide. So I want to cover those too because I like that, the way she ends the chapters. So key points. Claiming that people were gullible just because they believe something exists beyond nature, that's not an argument. That's the assumption that the natural world is all there is. And then secondly, she said supernatural claims and miracle claims more specifically vary widely. And in their evidential support, we have to evaluate them on a case-by-case basis. She says also there's strong evidence to support the miracle claims of the Gospels, regardless of how many bizarre things people have believed throughout history. And then finally, she says, people in the ancient world just didn't believe in the kind of resurrection miracle that was claimed for Jesus. The disciples believed Jesus had been raised from the dead despite what their culture told them. Remember, I'm just adding something here. When Jesus finds out Lazarus is dead and he goes to see Mary and Martha, and they say, yeah, we know that we're going to get raised at the end of all time, at the end of the world, at the end of the age. And Jesus is saying, no, this is something special. And he does a miracle at that point. So at that time period, the Jews did believe in a resurrection, but that was for everybody at the end of time. All right, so here's her conversation guide. I like this. She says, for example, she says, people sometimes think there's no reason to take the claims of Jesus' miracles any more seriously than some of these other gods and goddesses. They think people who lived a long time ago were just gullible. They were easily fooled. And then here's her question. Do you think we can determine whether Jesus performed miracles based on the fact that people have believed some bizarre things in history? Why or why not? Right? Do you hear that? So the question is, can you judge Jesus' miracles based on the fact that a lot of people have believed some bizarre things? And I think the answer is going to be no. And she said, if people get stuck on that, now remember she's talking mostly about dealing with kids, but you could talk to other adults about this. But she says if people have trouble answering that question, think about what she said about medical cures in the chapter. The fact that there have been some bizarre medical cures that were wrong, but could anybody have been right in earlier days in medical fixes for problems? Yeah. So I think that's a really good point. She said that proves the claims need to be evaluated on a case-by-case basis. So one more time, you rule out something supernatural and you haven't considered the evidence, that's just your assumption. It's not an argument. And she says, read Matthew 28, Luke 24, John 20. Do these verses suggest the disciples easily believe Jesus had been raised from the dead? Why or why not? Well, if you get your kids to sit there and look at those passages, they don't paint a picture of people who easily accepted a resurrection. She said, you might explain to your kids how no one at the time thought this kind of resurrection was possible. The disciples believed it happened to Jesus despite, right, there's the key word, despite their culture's opposing assumption. And then she says, apply the conversation. Here's her last thought. How would you respond to Richard Carrier's quote from the beginning of this chapter? So, one more time, here's what he had to say. I'll just summarize it real quickly. But he said, remember his essay is called Kooks and Quacks of the Roman Empire, a look into the world of the Gospels. So Carrier was saying, you go back far enough, you find all sorts of crazies back then. Some of them were frauds, but a lot of them were crazy, and even some people were innocent. They just were mistaken. But he said just there are tons and tons of people, fools and loons, he calls them. So he says, you look at that context, he says, so the Gospels don't seem so remarkable. And he says that leads to an important fact. And here's his key part. When the Gospels were written, skeptics and informed or critical minds were a small minority. Oh, by the way, I think that's probably true today, unfortunately. She says, although the gullible, this is Richard Carrier again, although the gullible, the credulous, and all these people are still around today, they were more common back in antiquity and taken far more seriously. And she says, no, that's actually not the case at all. Well, so that's one chapter from her book, and she's got all sorts of footnotes where she got her information, and it's 30 different conversations parents need to have with their kids. One more time, I know I've said this about her work before. This doesn't have to be you with a child at home. This could be just you. I mean, I got a lot out of these things without sitting down with my kids. My kids are older now, but so she's got a section on the identity of Jesus. Now that's where we are now, talking about the miracles. There's the teachings of Jesus, right? What did Jesus teach about hell, for example, about religion? And then part 3, the death of Jesus. Things like, did he die willingly? What did his death accomplish? How could he die if he's God? And then the 4th part is the resurrection of Jesus. Things like, why does it matter if he was resurrected? Was his tomb really empty? Maybe the disciples lied. So there's a question. Did they lie about the resurrection? And then the 5th part is the difference Jesus makes. So how is a person's view of the Bible different as a Christian? What does it mean to be saved? What does it mean to trust in Jesus? Why do Christians want to share their faith with others? So, wonderful book. Lee Strobel gives it a thumbs up. Jeff Myers, president of Summit Ministries, says this book is soaked in Scripture and awash with powerful evidence, fantastic examples, and thought-provoking discussion questions. It says it's so sneaky the way Natasha gets me thinking more deeply about my own faith as I learn how to help my kids deepen theirs. So there it is. I like that a lot. Gets me thinking about my own faith, and she does. So kids or no kids, I don't know what your situation is, but I think you'd like this book. So it's called Talking with Your Kids About Jesus. Look up Natasha Crain's podcast. She has a lot of powerful things to say. She's taken a lot of flack from atheists, so she's dealt with them for a long time, has really solid answers, and she goes to really good resources herself. So thank you for being part of this podcast, and I hope things are going well for you.